Chapter 36. Evelyn spun slowly on the end of the rope as the team of Kikori above her gradually paid out line, allowing her to descend. She was hanging in space, several meters clear of the cliff face. But a few meters below her, a large outcrop of rock bulged out, barring the way. As she turned back to face the cliff once more, the waiting Kikori let out a few more meters of rope until her feet touched the rock. Bracing her feet against it, she walked herself backwards down the cliff, using her legs and feet to keep her clear as the men above continued to lower her. Then she was past the outcrop and slowly spinning in space again as she descended. "You're nearly there," Alice called from below. Evelyn looked over her shoulder and could see the courier waiting at the foot of the cliff, barely 15 meters below her. She looked back up to where the rope now slid over the rock outcrop. Too much of that and the rope would fray and eventually break, she thought. But the rock was smooth and there wasn't far to go. She felt her feet touch solid ground and Alice's hand on her elbow to steady her. The rope went slack and she let out a huge sigh of relief. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Her legs were a little unsteady, a reaction to the fact that she had been dangling in space over an enormous drop, like a spider on a strand of web. Alice hurried to help free her from the harness of rope that the Kikori had created to hold her safely while they lowered her down the cliff face. "I'm glad that's over," Evelyn said. Alice nodded in heartfelt agreement. "If there's one thing that terrifies me, it's heights." Evelyn looked at her in surprise. "But you volunteered to go first." "Only because I thought if I watched you go, I'd never have the nerve to follow. I spent most of the time with my eyes shut tight." They cast loose the last of the rope that had been tied around Evelyn, and Alice tugged hard on it 4 times, a prearranged signal to tell the Kikori above that Evelyn was safely at the bottom of the cliff. The rope suddenly began a rapid ascent while the 2 girls took stock of their situation. The cliffs were over 250 meters high, and they had made the descent in 3 stages, with the Kikori climbers choosing suitable staging points along the way. At each point, a climber had waited with Alice and Evelyn while the rest of the team descended, then the girls were lowered down the next stage. The kayak, tied in a narrow bundle, lay on the rocks beside them. One of the Kikori had made the final stage of the descent with it, guiding it past the obstruction of the rock outcrop and untying it at the bottom. He had then climbed swiftly back up, aided by his companions hauling in on the rope to report that all was well. A few meters away, the waters of Mizu-Umi Bakudai lapped gently against the shore. Evelyn was relieved to see that the water was calm. The day had been sufficiently hair-raising, she thought, without the added complication of rough water for her initiation into the art of kayaking. "I guess we'd better start getting the boat assembled," she said. But before Alice could reply, a small shower of pebbles rattled off the rock outcrop above them. They both covered their heads against any stray pebbles that might come down, then looked up as a pair of boots appeared over the edge of the rock. The Kikori who had made the descent called for his companions to stop lowering. He braced himself out from the rock and slipped a pad of sheepskin between the rope and the rock face. Obviously, he shared Evelyn's earlier thought about the rope fraying. Then he signalled and the lowering recommenced. He dropped quickly to the rocks beside them, then looked up, grinning. "You came down faster than we did, Aiko," Evelyn said. He shrugged. "Do this many times," he told them. The girls noticed that he had disdained to use the harness arrangement that had been devised for them. He had simply tied a loop at the end of the rope and placed one foot in it as the others lowered him. Alice shuddered at the thought. Aiko had their travel packs over his shoulder, and he unslung them and set them on the ground beside the bundle of timber and oilskin. He gestured to it. "You need help?" Alice shook her head. "We should get used to assembling it ourselves." He nodded and stood back, watching as they quickly unrolled the bundle, arranged the frames and ribs, then fastened and braced the timbers so that the skeleton of the boat took shape. As they began to stretch the oilskin cover over the frame, straining against the lacing to bring it tight, he made a clicking noise with his tongue and stopped them. "Better this way," he said. Removing the retaining pins, he slid one of the main frames sideways, relaxing the tension so that the ribs of the boat collapsed slightly. "Tie now," he said, accompanying the word with gestures. "Then tighten ribs again." The girls quickly grasped the idea. They stretched the oilskin tight over the partially collapsed boat, lacing it firmly in place, then straightened the frame, levering it into its original position so that any remaining slack in the skin of the boat was now tensioned out. "Good thinking," Alice said appreciatively. "That makes it much easier." "Yes, I was afraid I was going to break a fingernail," Evelyn added. Alice looked up at her sharply, about to make a disparaging remark, when she realized the princess was joking. Feeling a little foolish, she bent her head to the task of fastening the last of the laces. When the last knot was tied, they stepped back and surveyed their handiwork. "Excellent," said Alice. Evelyn nodded. "You'd almost swear it was a boat." This time, Alice didn't react. She had a feeling that Evelyn's jokes were intended to conceal her nervousness about venturing across the lake in this seemingly frail craft. Alice could understand that. But she also knew that the kayak was far more robust and seaworthy than it looked. The two double-ended paddles had been tied in the original bundle, and she picked them up and carried them the few meters to the water's edge. When she returned, she saw that Aiko had been busy, blowing up the two pigskin air bladders that served as buoyancy chambers in case the boat was swamped in heavy weather. They pushed them into the bow and stern of the kayak, wedging them in place between the stringers, then stowed their travel packs into the space between the two seats, fastening an oilskin cover over them to keep them dry. "Right," said Alice. "Grab an end and let's go." The girls stooped to pick up the boat, but Aiko waved them back. He lifted it easily onto his hip, balancing it there, and smiled at them. "Aiko," Evelyn said, "we told you, we have to—" Yes, he said, waving his free hand disdainfully. "You have to do it yourselves. You can do tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. I do today." Alice and Evelyn exchanged a look. Then Alice shrugged. "Why not?" she said. "After all, we can do it tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow." She bowed and swept one hand towards the edge of the lake. "Aiko, my friend, after you." Grinning, the Kikori strode towards the lake, the two girls following. He set the kayak down in the shallow water at the lake's edge, leaving it half in and half out of the water. The two girls looked out over the wide expanse of water. From the cliff top, they had been able to see the far shore, a long, long way away. From water level, there was no sign of it. They might have been at the edge of an ocean. "It's certainly a big lake," Evelyn said quietly. She looked up at Aiko. "Aiko, what does Mizu Umi Bukadai mean?" The stockily built timber worker frowned uncertainly. "It means Mizu Umi Bukadai," he said. Evelyn made an impatient gesture. Yes, obviously, but what do those words mean?" Alice coughed, and Evelyn turned to her. The courier was repressing a smile. "They mean big lake," she said. Aiko nodded cheerfully, and Evelyn felt her cheeks colouring. Oh, of course, logical, I suppose. The Nihon-Jan have a penchant for literal place names, I've noticed, Alice told her. Then briskly, she dusted her hands off and stooped to the kayak, shoving it fully into the shallow water. Let's check the boat for leaks. The water was only a few centimetres deep at the shore, but the bank shelved steeply so that after 2 or 3 metres it was half a metre deep. From there, it rapidly became deeper, and the sand and stone bottom, easily visible close in, became lost from sight. Alice waded in, reacting to the shock of the icy water. Ow, that's cold! Make sure you don't tip us over, Evelyn. Make sure yourself, Evelyn replied crisply. But secretly, she knew that if anyone were going to tip the boat, it would be her. She went to step into the water to help, but Alice waved her back. Aiko can help me, he's heavier. She turned to the Kikori and gestured to the boat. Push it down as far as you can, please, Aiko. He nodded his understanding and waded in beside her. Reaching down, he braced his hands against the gunwale ribs and leaned his weight onto the boat. The hull sank deeper into the water under his weight, and Alice leaned in, searching up and down its length for any sign of water coming in. But the tight oilskin created an excellent watertight barrier, and there was no sign of a leak. That's great, Alice said, straightening. She beckoned to Evelyn. Okay, grab your paddle and come and get aboard. Take the front seat. That way I can keep an eye on you. Aiko moved quickly towards Evelyn, gesturing to indicate that he would lift her into the boat, but Alice stopped him. No, Aiko, better if she gets used to doing it without help. Getting in can be a little tricky, she explained to Evelyn. The other girl nodded and, paddle in hand, waded into the water. She, too, caught her breath at the icy touch of the lake. I can see why you don't want to tip over in this. Moving awkwardly, she raised one dripping wet foot and went to step over the kayak, planning to straddle it, but Alice stopped her. Not that way. Turn your back to it and get your behind in first. Sit in sideways with your backside on the seat. That gets the greater part of your body weight inside the boat, with only your legs to follow. Carefully, Evelyn lowered herself backwards onto the wooden seat. The boat tipped and she tensed nervously, but Alice held it steady. I've got it. Loosen up. Now, lift your feet and swing them into the boat. Put them on the ribs or the footrest in front of your seat, not the oilskin, she added. Don't ever put weight on that. Evelyn looked up at her. Any other blindingly obvious advice you've got for me? She asked sarcastically, and Alice shrugged. Never hurts to be sure, she said. She waited as Evelyn swung her legs and feet into the boat, settling herself in place. Then Alice released her hold on the stern and moved to the side of the kayak. Aiko stepped forward to hold the boat steady as she had been doing, but she waved him away. I'm fine, she said. She handed her paddle to Evelyn, who was waiting, a little anxiously. Evelyn, the boat is going to rock when I get in. Boats do that. It's perfectly normal. Don't try to counteract it. It'll recover itself. Just keep your weight central and keep your body loose, okay? Evelyn, tense as a fiddle string, nodded acknowledgement. Moving quickly and smoothly, Alice settled her weight into the rear seat and swung her legs inboard. The boat rocked under her weight, violently, it seemed to Evelyn, who couldn't help emitting a small squawk of alarm. Then it steadied, and she realized they were floating, drifting clear of the bank and the spot where Aiko stood, knee-deep in the water. He grinned encouragingly at them and waved. The tiny wavelets made a constant pock-pock sound against the tight skin of the kayak, and, For the second time that day, Evelyn let go a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Okay, hand me that paddle," she heard Alice say, and she turned awkwardly to hand the paddle back to her companion. As she did so, the boat lurched, and she instantly tensed up once more, turning quickly to face the bow. "Relax," Alice told her. "Just go with it, the way you would on a horse. If you suddenly go rigid, you'll find it harder to keep balanced and relaxed. Now, let's try with that paddle again, and see if you can avoid dropping it overboard." This time, Evelyn slid the paddle behind her without turning. She heard a slight grunt of pain as the blade caught Alice in the ribs. "Thank you for that," the courier said. "Sorry," Evelyn replied. She hated the feeling of being out of control. "Now, let's get this boat moving," Alice told her. "Left side first. Paddle smoothly and slowly. Don't try to do too much. Above all, try not to throw water all over me. On my count." Evelyn raised the unfamiliar paddle, waiting for Alice to call time. "All right, left side first. 1 and 2. 1 and 2. That's good. Keep it going. Nice and smooth. 1 and... Ow, damn it! If you splash me again, I'll throw you overboard. Now be careful." Which Evelyn thought was no way to speak to the Crown Princess of Araluen.